Star Wars is creating their very own MCU. I want to talk about everything we know about the next series of Star Wars movies, novels, comics, and games, and how it's all gonna tie together. This video is brought to you by Alex L., one of our executive producers via Patreon. What's up, everybody? It's Josh. Happy Star Wars Sunday. If you're watching this on Sunday, and if not, no big deal, but you should know we drop dope Star Wars videos every single Sunday. And this right here might be one of the best Star Wars videos we've done in some time, but it is a lengthy one, so grab a snack, buckle up, and let's get into this. I think the best way to start here is to introduce the idea that the Old Republic, the High Republic, Project Luminous, and the Dan and Dave series of films are all the same thing. Or a more correct way to say it is that they are all a part of the same thing. They are all a part of Star Wars' MCU. And in this deep dive, we are breaking it down into three separate parts. First, we're going to go over how this will work on the production side. Next, we'll talk about the setting and plots and everything we know about that. And finally, we will talk about the different villains in this series, the conflict that will be in the MCU of Star Wars, and how that will affect canon. So let's start with the production side of things. How is this all going to work together, and what has Disney been doing to set this up? Well, you see, this series of movies that Dan and Dave were working on didn't just go away after Dan and Dave left. In fact, that series is still going to take place in one way or another, even if Dan and Dave never returned to the project. Now, of course, new writers and directors, even if Dan and Dave had stayed, were going to put their own twist on things and make changes. But you have to remember that Dan and Dave were producing this series of movies, possibly writing a few of the films, but they were not said to direct. They weren't going to be doing a trilogy all on their own. It was actually going to be a series of movies that all interconnected. They were essentially world building with people at Lucasfilm, and whatever they did is actually still assets controlled by Lucasfilm and will likely be taken forward with this new Star Wars MCU. I mean, Jason Ward over at MakingStarWars.net has essentially said as much in a lot of his coverage of this fallout, but when you read back and look at the comments that Kathy Kennedy made and Dan and Dave made when they split ways, it's pretty obvious it was amicable, and Disney even does want them back. Here's what Dan and Dave said. They said, "There are only so many hours in the day, and we felt we could not do justice to both Star Wars and our Netflix projects. So we are regretfully stepping away." Kathy said, "David Benioff and Dan Weiss are incredible storytellers. We hope to include them in the journey forward when they are able to step away from their busy schedule to focus on Star Wars." I remember at the time everybody was confused, like, why are they being so nice to each other? I don't understand. This is a big split. But the thing is, guys, it's not actually a big split. Kennedy says she wants to include them in the journey forward when they're able to step away and focus on Star Wars. And that could literally happen. After the Netflix deal, these guys could literally come back and continue to work on the Star Wars MCU that, at least in some way, they helped start. Now, Project Luminous is another project that is spinning out of this same world building that Dan and Dave and Lucasfilm had started. The official word on Luminous is that it is a multimedia crossover done by some of the best writers in Star Wars. We know that Luminous was planned in conjunction with the world building that Dan and Dave did, and this is all because of the timing. Luminous was going to happen whether or not Dan and Dave stayed or left. Now, the thing that's really cool about Luminous to me is that the writers are going to tell their own individual stories and put their own mark on Project Luminous, but it will all tie together. This is just like the MCU. In the future, if filmmakers pitch an idea to Lucasfilm and they want to make a Star Wars movie, or they have an idea for a Star Wars story in a certain kind of medium, it will have to fit in to the established world, which in some part is being created by the writers of Project Luminous. So how do we know that Luminous and the High Republic is attached to whatever Dan and Dave were working on? Well, I mean, besides the fact that sources have literally told me that, there's actually evidence out there in what Star Wars has put out. Project Luminous was announced at Star Wars Celebration last year. That's April of 2019. But we know that Project Luminous and the High Republic predate that April date by at least years. The book Dooku Lost Jedi actually makes mention of the High Republic, and that book had to have been in production probably about a year before the announcement in April of 2019. There are also various social media posts by the different writers and creators of Project Luminous talking about several different workshops that they went to Skywalker Ranch for, and talking about how Luminous is probably the craziest and biggest thing they've ever been involved with. And if you look at the Zero.hu article that dropped talking about Project Luminous and the future of Star Wars, they talk about how this secret project was developed years ago, and it was made after Disney realized that their current path with the movies and books and comics had a lot of flaws. And so they straight up started building this stuff years ago. Now, to me, one of the reasons this is so exciting, and Alex agrees with me as well here, is that this is exactly what Star Wars fans have been wanting. It's well thought out and well planned world building, much like the MCU, and you're definitely still giving creators, and some of the best creators in Star Wars right now, sort of a carte blanche to do what they want with their story, but it has to fit in and tie in with the overall narrative. This should not only give the next series of films, which will also tie directly into this time period and world building that both Lucasfilm, Dan and Dave, and the Project Luminous writers are responsible for, but it will also make the ancillary material like the novels and the comics not only tie in perfectly with the movies, but actually add that value that fans were looking for in the first go around of the new Disney canon. It's all going to be one big story, just like the MCU. Now, let's talk about the setting and the plot as far as this new Star Wars MCU is concerned. There have been a lot of confusing reports about the Old Republic, about the High Republic. Where does Luminous fit in with all of that? Is Yoda going to be a part of this? Is Darth Bane going to be a part of this? And we think we've uncovered a lot of evidence to sort of clear up a lot of these problems. Going back to that Zero.hu article, they mentioned that Luminous is this multimedia story told around 300 to 400 years before the Phantom Menace. It will center around a group of Jedi setting out to explore the then unknown regions of the galaxy. There will be 3 different types of enemies, the darkest being ancient evils, Sith gods of some kind. Now, kudos to Alex on this, because he actually tracked down a now altered and slightly deleted Twitter thread all the way back in April of 2019, where somebody was asking about the High Republic mention from the Dooku novel. Now, Matt Martin of the Story Group was trying to explain the difference between the High Republic and the Old Republic by giving a link to the Middle Ages Wikipedia page. What's really fascinating is that Matt Martin kind of explains that it's all considered Old Republic, just like the Middle Ages actually refers to a long span of time that has different subset categories, including the High Middle Ages, the Early Middle Ages, and the Late Middle Ages. This further explains that a lot of this stuff is all referring to the same thing. People are saying, oh, there's an Old Republic game coming, even though it could technically be a High Republic and an Old Republic game. Dan and Dave were apparently working on the origins of the Force, the first moments of the Jedi and Sith, but you see, that could technically be Old Republic or High Republic. And the comparison to the Middle Ages is really interesting because this was a model that Legends used as well. And in fact, it's pretty telling to what the overall setting and plot for this whole era could actually be, which is what Alex and I think was going on when Matt Martin decided, or someone at Lucasfilm told him, to remove a lot of that Twitter thread. Now, if you look at the Middle Ages, it's really interesting because it all starts coming out of the Dark Ages, which was considered the early Middle Ages. This was a time of constant warring in Europe, and there were a lot of histories that were lost. There wasn't a lot of focus on things like art or things like writing or even history. And spinning out of the Dark Ages or the early Middle Ages came the High Middle Ages. In the High Middle Ages, population boomed. Science, art, writing, and history all boomed, and a lot of people went out and explored new areas. So if we parallel that area in human history, and also remember that this was covered in Legends, and this was exactly the way Legends handled the Old Republic as well, it's pretty safe to assume that the Old Republic will start about 1,000 years before the Phantom Menace. This will be at a time when the Jedi finally eliminate the Sith after after a war with the Sith Empire. Now, next up after that will come the High Republic, which, if we mirror to the High Middle Ages, will be a time period of population growth, of technology growing, of prosperity, and of further exploring the unknown regions of the galaxy. Now, even beyond that, the late Middle Ages actually have a plague, and it's sort of another Dark Age period followed by the Renaissance. And a similar thing happens in the actual Star Wars timeline. Darth Plagueis is literally a plague that comes in and ruins the High Middle Ages or the High Republic. And even though it's done in the shadows, him pruning the galaxy, preparing for his ascension that then we know Sidious takes over and actually fulfills, is a plague. It is this thing that shuts down the High Middle Ages or the High Republic and gives way to the Dark Times, to the Empire. Now, Alex and I both think that post Episode 9 we will get another renaissance in the galaxy, but I don't think Lucasfilm is going to visit that time period anytime soon. But kudos to Alex for tracking all that down and bringing it to my attention. It is fascinating stuff, and it does fit with the way Legends handled the Old Republic before the new Disney canon. Now, let me be clear about something. I'm not suggesting to you that everything Star Wars in this Star Wars MCU is all going to take place in the High Republic for the next 8 years of content. What I'm saying to you is that I think the Star Wars MCU is actually going to handle the Old Republic, and that can be anywhere from all the way back to 1,000 years ago when the Sith were defeated, but Darth Bane escapes and creates the Rule of Two, all the way to the Phantom Menace. But the time period of the High Republic, which is that 300 to 400 years before the Phantom Menace, is a very interesting time period because it's more or less a clean slate. Even Legends didn't really talk about this time period in the Star Wars galaxy. So the Star Wars MCU, which is basically everything moving forward in the connective tissue for the next 5 to 8 years of Star Wars properties, is all going to take place in the Old Republic, most of which will probably be taking place in the High Republic era of the Old Republic. And it's all going to be connected, and it's all going to be telling a singular story. Now, let's talk about the conflict and the villains for this new Star Wars MCU. This is not called Star Journeys or Star Chillin'. This is Star Wars, folks. There obviously is going to be conflict. And again, if we go back to the Zero.hu article, they talk about 3 different villains, the craziest of which is an ancient Sith being, or several of these beings that are sort of Sith gods. Now, the Sith even being mentioned at all during this time period will ruffle the feathers of a lot of canon junkies. And this is all because of this scene from The Phantom Menace.
He was trained in the Jedi arts.
My only conclusion can be that it was a Sith Lord.
Impossible. The Sith have been extinct for a millennium.
I do not believe the Sith could have returned without us knowing.
Hard to see the dark side is.
Master Mundi is saying that it's impossible, that the Sith have been extinct for a millennia, and what he is referring to is all the way back to the Dark Ages, the first early Middle Ages of the Old Republic, in which the Sith Empire was defeated and they were all slaughtered. Now, Darth Bane does escape from that time period and takes the Sith into hiding and creates the Rule of Two. But the Sith, as an empire and as something that was a major threat to the Jedi Order, was eliminated a millennia ago. But interestingly enough, if you look at the answers that Yoda and Mace Windu give in this conversation, it actually leaves a door open for possible encounters with Sith over the past couple of hundred of years that have been kept a secret. I personally think that Yoda knows something in this scene that the other Jedi Masters might not know. And considering that Yoda will be a part of the High Republic era, it's very possible he encountered some of these Sith gods or other Sith, but the Jedi of that time decided it was best for the Republic if it was swept under the rug and kept a secret. I mean, consider that Yoda knows at the end of The Phantom Menace that there are always 2, a master and an apprentice. Consider that in the Clone Wars, Yoda knows exactly who Darth Bane is and what the Rule of Two is as well. And even Mace Windu's comments about how he doesn't believe the Sith could have returned without them knowing indicates that he knows the Sith returning is a possibility. So whatever these Sith gods are, or whatever conflict the Jedi have with potential Sith in this High Republic era, could have been kept a secret. Because in my opinion, I think the Jedi of the High Republic time are trying to create a history. They're trying to alter history, and ultimately what they want is to defeat the dark side and never allow for the Sith to actually return. I think this is partially why they're even exploring these unknown regions, maybe to weed out remaining Sith that could be lingering, but definitely to try to get to all of the Force-sensitive children before they grow up. They're trying to bring them into the Jedi Order and leave no room for any Force-sensitive people in the galaxy to go to the dark side. And if Jedi or Force-sensitive people knew about Sith gods or these other powerful Sith creatures, it could potentially sway their opinions and give them a reason to be interested in the dark side. So what I think is going to happen is these Jedi are probably going to either destroy these Sith gods or force them out of the known galaxy, banish them to the unknown regions. And considering that we know that there were Sith cultists out in the unknown regions after the rise of Skywalker, it's not outside of the realm of possibilities that the High Republic Jedi were annexing out these powerful Sith creatures or Sith gods to create a more stable galaxy. We've also heard some rumors that the Rakata from Legends might actually make an appearance in future Star Wars properties, including the potential Rebels sequel that has been rumored for some time. Now, as for the other two main villains of the High Republic era, I think the next safest bet would be the Mandalorians. The Mandalorian show has put Mandalorians into the mainstream Star Wars fandom's lexicon. In fact, the wars with the Jedi that happened with Mandalore was actually mentioned in the finale of that show. And before that, the Jedi-Mandalorian wars were canonized in Dave Filoni's Star Wars Rebels. So Mandalorians are super popular now. Everybody loves the Mandalorian. And so it would make perfect sense to introduce the Mandalorian Empire in the High Republic as one of the main villains that the Crusading Jedi run into. And besides that, the Mandalorian Jedi conflicts were a big part of the Legends Old Republic. Now, as far as the third enemy, I actually think it will be remnants of the old Sith Empire. And even though the Sith were all eliminated and defeated, I think the remnants of the Imperial group that all worshiped the Sith or worked with the Sith will still exist. And after the war 1,000 years ago, they could have left the known parts of the core worlds and gone out into the unknown regions of the time, which will now be like the western reaches of the now known galaxy. And so I think it's very possible that we get sort of an Imperial threat, remnants of that army that don't actually have Sith anymore, but they still have a lot of military might, and there'll still be things that the Jedi have to confront. Now, that last one is pretty much pure speculation, but either way, I'm very excited to see the villains of this era. I think that the Rakata or some other kind of Sith god can totally work here, and it would be interesting if this is something Yoda knew about, but kept a secret from the rest of the Jedi Council and possibly even the Republic. I also think Jedi fighting Mandalorians is awesome. That's something we've wanted to see for a long, long time. And it just makes perfect sense to put it into this new Star Wars MCU time period. There's basically going to be a lot of impact on canon with whatever these stories end up being, because they're going to recontextualize things from the prequel era all the way to episode 9. All of this stuff is going to get more context, and we're going to get a ton of backstory. Not to mention, we're going to meet a ton of new Jedi characters, potentially a ton of new Mandalorian characters, and just characters in general that I think people will really love. Alex and I had a ton of fun working on this video, bringing up all the different points, like the connections to the Middle Ages and history, how that actually was reflected in the old Legends canon of the Old Republic, and how that will all have something to do with what Lucasfilm is developing now as their Star Wars MCU. So that's it, guys. That's all the information that we have for you, and we definitely want to know your thoughts about any and everything we mentioned in the comment section below. Now let's shout out Ed Dunn. Indeed, the Force-sensitive children of the Chiss Empire were referred to as Skywalkers. So shout out to you, Ed Dunn. Now let's ask another nerd card question before we get out of here. I want to know, in Legends, who was the Sith Master of Darth Plagueis? Answer that question in the comment section below. Again, I want to remind everybody that this video is brought to you by Alex L., one of our executive producers via Patreon. And just in general, all the support we get from Patreons really helps us push out quality content and keep the lights on over here. So if you like the content and you want to support the channel, consider checking out our Patreon today. As I always say, I hope you're having an awesome and a nerdy day, and I'll see you in the next video.